The thunder of hooves against hardened earth was the only sound that dared disturb the vast silence of the Wyoming Territory as Vivian Donovan clutched her 5-year-old daughter against her chest, desperately scanning the horizon for shelter from the approaching storm. The year was 1876, and the unforgiving landscape of the American frontier seemed determined to claim 2 more souls for its collection. Her daughter, Emma, hadn't spoken a word since the night her father was killed by outlaws 3 months ago, her tiny face frozen in a permanent mask of quiet suffering that broke Vivian's heart anew each morning. "Just a little further, sweetheart," Vivian whispered, though her parched throat made the words sound like a promise she couldn't keep. The rickety wagon she'd purchased with the last of their savings had broken an axle 10 miles back, forcing them to continue on foot toward the mining town of Mineral Point. With each step, Vivian's boots, never designed for such a journey, rubbed raw blisters against her heels. The first fat droplets of rain began to fall as the distant rumble of thunder grew louder. Emma's grip tightened around her mother's neck, her wide blue eyes so like her father's fixed on the darkening skies. Vivian's arms ached from carrying her child for miles, but she wouldn't put her down. Not when Emma's silence felt like the only thing more fragile than their chances of survival. Just as the rain began to fall in earnest, Vivian spotted a flicker of movement on the ridge ahead. A rider appeared, silhouetted against the gray sky, approaching at a steady pace. Her hand instinctively moved to the small derringer, concealed in her skirt pocket, the last gift her husband had given her before tragedy struck. The horseman slowed as he neared, and Vivian could make out a tall figure beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His sturdy mare snorted and pawed at the ground, seemingly as wary of strangers as her master. "Madam," the man called out, his voice deep yet gentle somehow. "Storm's coming in fast. Not safe to be on foot out here." Vivian held Emma tighter, her fingers wrapped around the derringer. "We're managing just fine, sir," she replied, summoning what little strength remained in her voice. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, keeping a respectful distance. Up close, she could see his face more clearly weathered by sun and wind, with eyes the color of faded denim beneath his hat. A few days' worth of stubble covered his jaw, but his expression held no malice. "Name's Mason Yates," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. "Run a small ranch about 3 miles from here. Got a dry barn and hot food if you're willing." His gaze moved to Emma, whose face remained buried in her mother's shoulder. "Headed to Mineral Point," Vivian said, not yet ready to trust this stranger, no matter how civil his manner. "My brother's expecting us." Mason nodded, replacing his hat as the rain began to fall harder. "Mineral Point's still 15 miles out. Won't make it before this storm hits full force." He gestured to the clouds above, now heavy and dark. "I've got room for 2 more hearts at my place, madam, just until the weather clears." Something in his choice of words, not 2 more bodies or 2 more people, but hearts, made Vivian hesitate. Emma shivered against her, the child's thin dress already damp from the increasing downpour. Lightning cracked across the sky, followed by a boom of thunder that made Emma flinch violently. Mason's horse whinnied in alarm, but the cowboy maintained his calm demeanor, one hand steady on the reins. "I'm Vivian Donovan," she finally said. "This is my daughter, Emma." Mason's smile was slight but genuine. "Pleasure to meet you both, Mrs. Donovan." "Miss," she corrected, the word still strange on her tongue. "My husband's been gone 3 months now," understanding flickered in Mason's eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Donovan." He offered his hand to help her onto his horse, but Vivian managed to climb up herself, still clutching Emma. "I can take the little one," Mason offered, but Emma's grip tightened fiercely around her mother's neck. She doesn't take well to strangers, Vivian explained, not wanting to elaborate on her daughter's silence. Or anyone these days. Mason nodded, no questions asked, and took the reins to lead the horse on foot. Ranch isn't far. Rosie here can carry you both just fine. The rain fell in sheets now, but Mason walked steadily forward, seemingly unbothered by the downpour soaking through his duster. Vivian found herself studying his broad shoulders, the way he occasionally glanced back to check on them, the gentle way he spoke to his horse when the animal grew nervous at another crack of lightning. True to his word, a small ranch came into view after about 40 minutes of walking. It wasn't grand by any means, a modest cabin with a barn nearby, a corral with a few horses huddled together against the rain, and what looked like grazing land stretching behind it. Home sweet home, Mason said without pretense, leading them toward the barn first to settle his mare. Inside, the building was solid and dry, the scent of hay and horses surprisingly comforting after hours in the open elements. Mason helped Vivian down from the horse, careful not to touch Emma, who remained clinging to her mother like a small, silent shadow. "Cabin's just there," he said, gesturing through the open barn door. "Go on and get settled by the fire. I'll be along after I take care of Rosie here." Vivian hesitated, still clutching her precious burden. "Mr. Yates, Mason," he corrected gently. "Mason," she amended. "Thank you, we won't impose long." His eyes met hers, steady and clear. "No imposition, Miss Donovan. Not safe for anyone to travel in this weather, least of all a lady and her child." The cabin was simple but clean, with a stone fireplace that still held glowing embers. Vivian stoked it back to life, finally setting Emma down on a worn but comfortable-looking chair nearby. The child's eyes darted around the unfamiliar space, her tiny hands fidgeting with the wet fabric of her dress. "It's all right, Emma," Vivian soothed, though she wasn't entirely convinced herself. "We're safe here, just until the storm passes." She was wringing water from Emma's hair when Mason entered, carrying a stack of firewood. He added logs to the growing flames without comment, then disappeared into what Vivian assumed was the kitchen, returning moments later with a pot of coffee and 3 mugs balanced on a tray. "Figured you could use something warm," he said, pouring coffee into 2 of the mugs and what appeared to be warm milk into the third. He set the milk near Emma with a gentle smile. "My ma always said warm milk was good for chasing away thunder frights." Emma didn't reach for the cup, but her eyes followed Mason's movements with cautious interest, the first sign of engagement she'd shown with anyone outside her mother in months. "Your daughter," Mason said quietly as he handed Vivian her coffee. "Has she always been so quiet?" Vivian's throat tightened. "No," she managed. "She was quite talkative before we lost her father." She took a sip of the coffee, grateful for its warmth. 3 months now and not a word." Mason nodded, his expression solemn. "Grief affects us all differently. Some find too many words, some can't find any at all." "You speak from experience?" Vivian asked, suddenly curious about this solitary rancher who spoke with unexpected depth. "Lost my wife and son to fever 5 years back," he said simply, no self-pity in his tone. "Everyone in these parts has lost someone, Miss Donovan. Nature of life out here." They fell silent then, the only sounds the crackling fire and rain drumming against the roof. After a few minutes, to Vivian's astonishment, Emma reached for the mug of milk, taking a small sip before setting it back down carefully. Mason smiled but made no comment that might startle the child back into her shell. Instead, he stood and moved toward a small pantry. "Got some stew I can heat up if you're hungry. Nothing fancy, but it's filling." That would be wonderful, Vivian said, realizing how long it had been since they'd had a proper meal. I could help if you'd like. Mason waved her off. You just get dry and warm. Plenty of time for helping later, if you've a mind to. As he busied himself in the kitchen, Vivian found herself watching him, the careful precision of his movements, the quiet competence in everything he did. There was something comforting about his presence, something that made the knot of anxiety she'd carried for months loosen just a fraction. The stew was indeed simple but delicious, filled with tender venison and root vegetables. Emma ate without prompting, another small miracle that brought tears to Vivian's eyes when Mason wasn't looking. "You're headed to your brother's in Mineral Point?" Mason asked as they finished their meal. Vivian nodded. "Thomas wrote that there's work there, in the boarding house his wife runs. After John, my husband, was killed, there wasn't much left for us in Colorado." "Outlaws?" Mason asked quietly, his eyes flickering to Emma to make sure she wasn't listening too closely. "Yes," Vivian confirmed. "They came for our horses. John tried to stop them." Her voice faltered. Emma saw it all from where I'd hidden her under the porch steps. Mason's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry," he said, and she could tell he meant it. "Too many good people lost to lawlessness out here." After dinner, Mason insisted Vivian and Emma take his bed, while he would sleep on a pallet by the fire. Too exhausted to argue, Vivian accepted his offer. The bedroom was as neat as the rest of the cabin, with a handmade quilt on the bed and a small shelf of books that surprised her: classics by Dickens and Twain, poetry collections, and a well-worn Bible. "Your home is lovely," she told Mason as he brought in fresh water for washing. "Not what I expected from a bachelor rancher." A faint smile touched his lips. "My mother would roll in her grave if I lived like a savage, Miss Donovan. She raised me better than that." Later, as the storm continued to rage outside, Vivian lay beside her sleeping daughter, listening to the occasional creak of floorboards as Mason moved about in the main room. For the first time in months, she felt something other than fear and grief, something that might, if given time, resemble hope. Morning brought clear skies and the realization that their clothes, which Mason had hung to dry overnight, were still damp. "Storms passed, but the trail to town will be mud for a day or two," Mason observed as he scrambled eggs for breakfast. "You're welcome to stay until things dry out." Vivian wanted to refuse, to maintain her independence, but the practical reality of traveling through mud with a small child made the decision for her. "If you're certain we're not imposing." "I meant what I said yesterday," Mason replied, setting a plate before Emma with a gentle smile. "Always room here." The day passed peacefully. Mason tended to his small herd of cattle and the few horses in his corral, while Vivian, feeling the need to earn their keep, took stock of his kitchen and prepared a more substantial dinner than he was likely accustomed to making for himself. Emma, to Vivian's amazement, followed Mason around for part of the afternoon, watching silently as he repaired a section of fence damaged in the storm. He spoke to her as he worked, explaining what he was doing without demanding any response. By the time the sun began to set, Emma had collected a small pile of interesting stones and leaves that she arranged carefully on the porch steps. "She's warming up," Mason observed quietly as he and Vivian watched from the doorway. "Children are resilient, given time and patience." "I've been afraid she might never speak again," Vivian admitted. "The doctor in Denver said it was shock, that her voice would return when she felt safe again." Mason considered this. "My grandmother had a saying, wounded hearts heal from the inside out. Can't see the healing happening, but one day you look and there it is." That evening, after Emma had fallen asleep, Vivian found herself sitting beside Mason on the porch, The vast Wyoming sky spread above them like a blanket of stars. "You could have a good life in Mineral Point," Mason said after a comfortable silence. "It's growing fast. Good folk there for the most part." "Have you lived in these parts long?" Vivian asked. "Born and raised not 20 miles from here," he replied. "Left for a spell, fought in the war, tried my hand at prospecting in California. Came back after my father passed to take over the ranch." "And then you married," Vivian said softly. Mason nodded, his profile strong against the starlight. "Rebecca was the school teacher. Never thought a woman like that would look twice at her rough cowboy, but she did." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Our boy would have been 7 now." Vivian's heart ached for him. "I'm sorry, Mason," he shrugged slightly. "Life goes on. Ranch keeps me busy." "It must get lonely out here," she ventured. "Used to it," he replied, then glanced at her. "But I won't pretend it isn't nice having voices in the house again, even if one of them is just mine." He smiled to soften the words. 3 days passed, and though the trails were now passable, neither Vivian nor Mason mentioned her departure. Each day settled into a comfortable rhythm, Mason tending to his ranch work, Vivian keeping house and preparing meals, Emma following one or the other of them around, her eyes growing more alert, her movements more confident. On the 4th evening, as Mason taught Emma how to play checkers by the firelight, the little girl suddenly reached out and touched his hand when he made a move she apparently disagreed with. Both adults froze, watching as Emma deliberated, then carefully moved one of her red pieces instead. "Well, I'll be," Mason said softly, his voice filled with wonder. "Looks like I've met my match." Vivian felt tears spring to her eyes. It was such a small gesture, but for Emma, it represented an enormous step, willingly touching someone outside her mother, engaging in play, showing preference and decision-making. All the things that grief had stolen from her. Later, after Emma was asleep, Vivian found Mason on the porch again, whittling what appeared to be a small wooden horse. "I should arrange for transportation to Mineral Point soon," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "We've imposed on your hospitality far too long." Mason's hands stilled on the carving. "Hicks from the neighboring ranch is heading that way with his wagon tomorrow. Could arrange passage for you if that's what you truly want." He looked up at her then, his eyes searching. "But I hope you know you're both welcome here as long as you like." Vivian's heart skipped a beat. "Mason, we barely know each other." "I know enough," he said simply. "I know you're brave enough to cross half the frontier alone with a child to protect. I know you're kind enough to make my house feel like a home again in just a few days. I know your daughter is starting to heal just being around you in a place where she feels safe." He set the carving aside. "And I know that for the first time in 5 years, I'm thinking about tomorrow with something other than duty." Vivian felt her cheeks flush. "It wouldn't be proper." "No, it wouldn't," he agreed. "Unless there was an understanding between us." "What kind of understanding?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mason stood, moving closer but still keeping a respectful distance. "The kind where I tell you that these few days have awakened something in me I thought was long buried. The kind where I ask if you might consider staying not as a guest, but with purpose, to see if whatever this is between us might grow into something worthy of both our pasts." Vivian's mind whirled. This wasn't what she had planned. She had a brother waiting, a job promised, a new start already mapped out, and yet, "What about Emma?" she asked. "She needs stability, security." "She seems to like it here," Mason observed, "and I've grown mighty fond of her too." Children need open spaces to heal, room to run and be loud when they're ready to be loud again. "And if I say we need to continue to Mineral Point, then I'll help you get there safely," he said without hesitation. "No obligation, Vivian." Just an offer from a man who's recognized a second chance when it appeared on his doorstep. She took a deep breath. "I need time to think." "Take all the time you need," Mason replied, picking up his carving again. "Some decisions shouldn't be rushed." Vivian slept fitfully that night, torn between the security of her original plan and the unexpected possibility that had opened before her. By morning, she'd made her decision they would continue to Mineral Point as planned. It was the sensible choice, the safe choice. But when she went to tell Mason, she found him and Emma in the barn, the little girl perched carefully on a gentle mare as Mason led the horse in slow circles. Emma's face showed no smile, but her eyes were bright with interest, her small hands gripping the saddle horn with determination. "She asked to try," Mason said when he spotted Vivian, his voice filled with barely contained excitement. "Not with words, mind you. She tugged my sleeve and pointed, but it was asking all the same." Vivian watched her daughter, this child who had been frozen in trauma for months, now reaching out toward life again. "She loves it here," she said softly. "As do you, if I'm not mistaken," Mason ventured. Their eyes met across the barn, and Vivian felt something shift inside her, a letting go of fear, perhaps, or the recognition that plans, like hearts, sometimes need to change course. "My brother will worry if we don't arrive," she said finally. "We can send word," Mason suggested. "Explain that you found a position here instead." "A position?" Vivian raised an eyebrow, Mason's cheeks colored slightly above his stubble. "To start with, until we know for certain." Emma made a small sound, then not quite a word, but a deliberate vocalization of pleasure as the horse took another gentle turn around the barn. It was the first sound they'd heard from her since that terrible night. "I think," Vivian said, her voice thick with emotion, "that we might stay. For a while, at least." Mason's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I was hoping you'd say that." The weeks that followed took on a rhythm as natural as breathing. Vivian wrote to her brother, explaining their change in plans, receiving a cautiously supportive reply and a promise to visit when the mountain passes cleared in spring. Mason taught Emma to help with the gentler ranch chores, feeding chickens, collecting eggs, brushing the horses, tasks the child approached with solemn dedication. And though Emma still didn't speak, her silent communications grew more expressive: gestures, facial expressions, the occasional sound of satisfaction or frustration. It was progress that brought tears to Vivian's eyes when she thought about how far they'd come. One evening in late September, as the first chill of autumn touched the air, Mason returned from a trip to town with supplies and a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For Emma," he said, handing it to the child who had come to the door to greet him, her eyes curious. Emma unwrapped it carefully to reveal a beautiful hand-carved wooden horse, painted to match the gentle mare she had grown so fond of riding. "Made the body myself," Mason explained, "but had Mrs. Simmons in town paint it proper. She used to do fine art back east before she married the blacksmith." Emma studied the horse intently, running her small fingers over the carved details. Then, to the astonishment of both adults, she looked directly at Mason and whispered, "Thank you." The words hung in the air like a miracle. Vivian's hand flew to her mouth, tears immediately spilling down her cheeks. Mason knelt before Emma, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "You are most welcome, Miss Emma," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion Vivian could see him fighting to control. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep clutching her wooden horse, Vivian found Mason on the porch, staring up at the star-filled sky. "You gave her back her voice," Vivian said softly, joining him. Mason shook his head. "She found it herself, just needed to feel safe enough to use it again." Vivian touched his arm, feeling the strength beneath his shirt sleeve. You've given us both so much, Mason. A home, security, hope. She hesitated. I don't know how I'll ever repay such kindness. He turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. I'm not looking to be repaid, Vivian. Everything I've done has been because. He took a deep breath. Because I've fallen in love with you, both of you, and I'd be honored if you'd consider making this arrangement permanent. Are you proposing, Mason Yates? Vivian asked, her heart suddenly racing. Inelegantly, perhaps, he admitted with a rueful smile. But yes, I am. Vivian thought of the journey that had brought her here, the grief, the fear, the desperate hope for a new beginning. She thought of Emma speaking her first words in this place that had somehow become home, and she thought of Mason, this quiet, steadfast man who had opened his heart and his home when they needed it most. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I will marry you. His kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with a passion that surprised them both. When they finally parted, breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. I never expected to find love again, he whispered. Nor I, Vivian admitted. But perhaps that's how it happens when we've stopped looking, stopped expecting. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Mineral Point, with Emma as their only attendant, proudly carrying a basket of autumn wildflowers. Vivian's brother Thomas and his wife made the journey from town to witness the ceremony, bringing news of a mining boom that was bringing more settlers to the area every day. You could have had a comfortable life in town, Thomas remarked at the small reception afterward, watching Emma help Mason cut the wedding cake Mrs. Peterson from the neighboring ranch had baked for the occasion. Are you sure this is what you want? Life out here isn't easy, especially in winter. Vivian followed his gaze, smiling as Emma actually giggled at something Mason had whispered to her. I've never been more certain of anything, she told her brother. This is where we belong. That night, after Emma had been tucked into bed in her new room formerly, the small study Mason had converted for her husband and wife found themselves alone for the first time since exchanging vows. Mrs. Yates, Mason said, the name still new and wonderful on his tongue. Mr. Yates, Vivian replied, suddenly shy despite the weeks they'd spent under the same roof. He crossed the room to her, taking her hands in his. I want you to know, he said earnestly, that I will spend every day trying to be worthy of the trust you've placed in me, yours and Emma's. Vivian reached up to touch his face. You already are, she whispered, and then there were no more words needed as he gathered her into his arms and carried her to their bed. Winter came early that year, blanketing the ranch in snow by early November. The days grew shorter, the work harder, but inside the cabin, warmth and light prevailed. Emma's vocabulary expanded daily, though she remained selective about when and to whom she would speak. With Mason, she was increasingly verbal, following him around the property asking questions about everything from how horses sleep, standing up to why the sky changes color at sunset. She's making up for lost time, Vivian observed one evening, watching her daughter help Mason build a model of the ranch from scrap wood at the kitchen table. Smart as a whip, this one, Mason agreed, ruffling Emma's hair affectionately, thinking she might be ready for school come spring. Emma looked up at that. Will I ride Daisy to school? She asked, referring to the gentle mare that had become exclusively her horse in recent weeks. When you're a bit bigger, Mason promised. For now, I'll drive you in the wagon. Both of us, Vivian added, one hand resting unconsciously on her abdomen, where the first signs of new life had recently made themselves known. Mason's eyes widened as he caught the gesture, understanding dawning across his features. Truly, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Vivian nodded, her eyes filling with happy tears. Dr. Patterson confirmed it yesterday when he was in the area. Come summer, we'll be a family of 4. Mason was around the table in an instant, lifting Vivian from her chair and spinning her in a careful circle before setting her gently back on her feet. "A baby," he breathed, his face alight with joy. "Emma, did you hear? You're going to be a big sister." Emma considered this new information with characteristic seriousness. "Where will the baby sleep? We'll build a cradle," Mason assured her. "Right here by the fire where it's warm." "Can I help?" Emma asked, her eyes bright with interest. "Couldn't do it without you," Mason promised, including her in their embrace. Later that night, as they lay together in the darkness, Mason's hand protectively covering the still flat plane of her stomach, Vivian thought about the journey that had brought them here, the tragedy that had silenced her daughter, the broken wagon axle that had left them stranded, the storm that had driven them to seek shelter with a lonely rancher. "What are you thinking about?" Mason asked, his voice drowsy against her hair. "How strangely life works," she replied. "If you hadn't found us that day—" "I was meant to find you," he said with quiet certainty. "Some things are just meant to be." Spring arrived with its usual Wyoming fickleness, warm sunny days followed by sudden snowstorms, then rapid thaws that turned the ranch into a sea of mud, before drying out just in time for the next cycle. But by mid-May, the land had settled into true spring, with wildflowers dotting the pastures and new calves wobbling alongside their mothers. Emma, now 6 years old, started school in Mineral Point, riding proudly in the wagon with Mason each morning, a lunch pail packed by Vivian and a head full of stories to share when she returned each afternoon. Her silence was now just a painful memory, replaced by a little girl who chattered almost constantly, making up for all the words she'd held inside during those dark months. Vivian's pregnancy progressed without complication, her body growing round and full as summer approached. Mason treated her like precious cargo, taking on extra work to spare her, enlisting Emma's help with household chores, and reading to them both in the evenings from his collection of books. It was during one of these peaceful evenings, with Emma already asleep and the June twilight stretching long outside the windows, that Vivian felt the first sharp pain. Setting aside her mending, she placed a hand on her swollen belly, waiting to see if it would pass. When the second pain came, stronger than the first, she knew. "Mason," she said calmly, not wanting to alarm him, "I think it's time." His book dropped forgotten to the floor as he leapt to his feet. "Now, but it's still 3 weeks early." "Babies come when they're ready," Vivian replied, attempting a smile despite the growing discomfort. "This one seems impatient to join us." The next hours passed in a blur of increasing pain. Mason sent their nearest neighbor, young Jim Peterson, galloping toward town to fetch the midwife, while he helped Vivian to their bed and checked on the still sleeping Emma. "She'll be fine," Vivian assured him through gritted teeth as another contraction seized her. "It's you I'm worried about." "You look pale as a ghost." Mason managed a strained laugh. "Faced down rustlers and wolves without blinking, but this has me terrified." The midwife arrived just as Vivian's labor intensified. Mrs. Abernathy was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had delivered most of the children in the county. She shooed Mason from the room with instructions to boil water and keep Emma occupied when she woke. "Not my first baby, nor my last," the midwife assured Vivian as she efficiently prepared for the birth. "You've got strong hips and a good constitution. We'll have this little one in your arms before the sun's high tomorrow." Mrs. Abernathy's prediction proved accurate. After a night of labor that tested Vivian's strength to its limits, their son was born just as the first pink light of dawn touched the eastern horizon. Samuel John Yates announced his arrival with a lusty cry that brought his father running from where he'd been pacing the front room. "A boy," Mrs. Abernathy announced, placing the swaddled infant in Vivian's arms, strong and healthy if a touch early. Mason stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with wonder as he beheld his wife and newborn son. "A boy," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Vivian, he's perfect." Emma appeared beside him then, rumpled from sleep, her curiosity overcoming any trepidation. "Is that my brother?" she asked, peering around Mason's leg. "Come meet him," Vivian invited, and Emma approached the bed cautiously, studying the tiny red face with its shock of dark hair. "He's very small," she observed seriously. "He'll grow," Mason assured her, lifting her up so she could see better, "just like you did." "What's his name?" Emma wanted to know. "Samuel," Vivian told her, "but we can call him Sam." Emma considered this. "I'm going to teach him everything," she declared with the confidence only a 6-year-old could muster. "About horses and chickens and numbers and letters." "I'm counting on it," Mason told her, his arm around her small shoulders as they gazed at the newest member of their family. The years that followed brought changes both expected and surprising. The town of Mineral Point grew rapidly as the mines prospered, bringing new settlers, businesses, and eventually a railroad spur that connected the once isolated community to the wider world. Mason's careful management expanded their ranch from a modest homestead to a respectable operation with a reputation for quality cattle and horses. Emma thrived in school, her early trauma now just a shadow that occasionally passed across her otherwise sunny nature. She developed her father's gift with horses and her mother's quick mind, becoming a bridge between the ranch and town as she grew into adolescence. Samuel Sam to everyone but his mother when he was in trouble, grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's thoughtful demeanor and his mother's determined spirit. By age 5, he was following Mason everywhere, absorbing the lessons of ranch life with an eagerness that made his father beam with pride. When Sam was 7 and Emma 14, the family welcomed another addition, Catherine Rebecca Yates, named for both grandmothers neither child had ever known. Tiny and fair where Sam had been robust and dark, Catherine completed their family circle in ways none of them had anticipated. 3 children, Vivian mused one evening as she and Mason watched them from the porch, Emma reading a book to her siblings in the last light of day, her voice animated as she acted out the different characters. "If someone had told me 10 years ago that you'd end up married to a dusty rancher with 3 beautiful children," Mason finished for her, his arm around her waist. "Would you have believed them?" Vivian leaned her head against his shoulder. "Not for a moment, and yet I can't imagine any other life now." "Nor I," Mason agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Though I still wonder sometimes what made you stay. You could have gone on to Mineral Point as planned." Vivian thought back to that pivotal moment, Emma on horseback, the first spark of healing visible in her eyes, Mason's careful guidance bringing their daughter back to life step by step. "I stayed because you showed me what mattered most," she said simply. "Safety, kindness, patience. Room for our hearts to heal and grow." She turned in his embrace to face him. "You said you had room for 2 more hearts that day on the trail, but what you really gave us was room to become whole again." Mason's eyes, still that same faded denim blue, but now creased at the corners from years of sun and smiles, held hers with the same steady warmth that had first earned her trust. "Best decision I ever made, stopping for that bedraggled woman and her silent child on the road to Mineral Point. Best decision I ever made was accepting your offer," Vivian replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him softly. Their moment was interrupted by Sam's excited shout. "Pa, the foal's coming. Old Bessie's finally having her baby," Mason chuckled against Vivian's lips. "Duty calls, Mrs. Yates." "Always does," she agreed with a smile. "Go on, I'll bring lanterns." As Mason hurried toward the barn, children racing ahead of him with all the excitement that a new birth on the ranch always generated, Vivian paused to take in the scene, the home they had built together, the family that had grown from tragedy and chance, the love that had bloomed in the most unexpected of circumstances. 10 years ago, she had been a widow traveling alone with her silent child, searching for safety in a harsh and unforgiving land. Now she was the heart of this thriving ranch, mother to 3 children, wife to a man whose quiet strength had rebuilt her world. Gathering the lanterns from their hooks by the door, Vivian followed her family toward the barn, toward the newest life beginning under their care. The Wyoming night spread vast and star-filled above them, the same sky that had witnessed their first meeting on that storm-threatened trail so long ago. Some journeys, Vivian reflected as she watched Mason lift little Catherine so she could see the newborn foal taking its first wobbly steps, led exactly where you were meant to be all along. And sometimes, the most unexpected detours became the path home. As if sensing her thoughts, Mason looked up and met her gaze across the lantern-lit barn, his smile as warm and true as it had been on their wedding day. Emma, now almost as tall as her mother, slipped an arm around Vivian's waist. "Glad we stayed, Mama?" she asked quietly. Vivian hugged her daughter close, watching as Sam carefully stroked the foal's nose under Mason's guidance, while Catherine clapped her small hands in delight. "More than words can say, sweetheart," Vivian replied. "More than words can say." In the years that followed, the Yates Ranch became a cornerstone of the community. Mason's fair dealings and hard work earned him a position on the town council, while Vivian's organizational skills made her indispensable in establishing Mineral Point's first proper school building and library. Their ranch house, expanded twice to accommodate their growing family and frequent visitors, became known as a place of welcome and warmth to travelers and neighbors alike. Emma, with her gift for horses and her mother's determination, eventually took over the horse training side of the ranch operations, developing a breeding program that produced mounts sought after throughout the territory. She married Jim Peterson's youngest son Daniel at 20, building a small house just over the ridge from the main ranch house. Sam grew into his father's right-hand man, his quiet competence and innovative ideas helping to modernize the ranch as the 19th century gave way to the 20th. He brought home a bride from Denver, a school teacher named Margaret who reminded Vivian so much of herself at that age, brave enough to leave everything familiar behind for love and the promise of a new life. Catherine, their unexpected blessing, inherited her mother's quick mind and her father's steady patience. She devoured books faster than Vivian could supply them, eventually leaving for college in the East, the first in their community to do so. Though her path took her farther from home than her siblings, she returned often, bringing new ideas and perspectives that enriched them all. Through it all, the harsh Wyoming winters, the uncertain harvests, the changing landscape of the West as railroads and telegraphs and automobiles gradually transformed their once isolated existence, Mason and Vivian remained each other's anchors. Their love, born in that moment of chance encounter on a storm-threatened trail, deepened with each challenge overcome, each joy shared, each loss weathered together. On their 30th anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. As twilight fell, Mason led Vivian away from the festivities to the old porch swing where they had spent so many evenings throughout their marriage. 30 years, he mused, his hair now silver but his eyes still bright with the same warmth that had first won her heart. Hard to believe it's been so long since that stormy afternoon. Vivian leaned against him, content in the familiar strength of his shoulder. And yet, in some ways, it feels like yesterday. Mason took her hand, his fingers entwining with hers in a gesture as natural as breathing. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been riding that trail that day? If you'd made it to Mineral Point as planned? Vivian considered the question. I think, she said slowly, that life has a way of leading us where we need to go, even when the path seems unclear. But I'm grateful every day that our paths crossed when they did. From inside the house came the sound of laughter, their children, their grandchildren, the extended family that had grown from that moment of kindness on a lonely trail. I told you I had room for 2 more hearts, Mason reminded her, his voice tender with memory. But the truth is, you and Emma gave my heart room to live again. Vivian turned to face him, the man who had been her partner through 3 decades of life on the frontier, a frontier that had gradually transformed around them into settlements, then towns, then the modern world of 1906. His face was weathered now, lined with the evidence of years spent under the Wyoming sun, but to her, he was still the steady, kind-eyed cowboy who had offered shelter from the storm. I love you, Mason Yates, she said simply, today and always. And I love you, Vivian Yates, he replied, leaning forward to kiss her with the same gentle passion that had sustained them through 30 years of marriage. Today and always. As darkness settled over the ranch, stars appearing one by one in the vast Wyoming sky, they remained on the porch, hands linked, hearts still finding room to grow together after all these years. Inside, their legacy continued in the voices of children and grandchildren, in the home they had built, in the love that had transformed 2 broken hearts into a family that would endure long after they were gone. It had begun with a chance encounter, a woman traveling alone with her silent child, a cowboy with room in his heart for them both. But what had started as shelter from a storm had become the foundation for a lifetime of love, proving that sometimes the most unexpected journeys lead exactly where we're meant to be.